Hello everyone, I'm Václav Westphal or Vasek, and this is my presentation about the research on state and national identity in the United States. The center of this presentation is a question, where are you from? Since I'm interested to see if Americans perceive themselves more as Americans or as state members. First, I will introduce at least basics of theory of identity and national identity. It's important to notice that both these theories are quite complex, and I will cover only the very basics which are needed for this research. This will be later followed by the case study of United States, and then we will dive into the interviews with 4 Americans. Speaking about identity, it's important to notice that one person is consisted from many different identities, let it be the national identity, gender identity, sexual identity, or just identities based on someone's interests. And each person, as a result, has their unique set of identities. But most of these identities are socially created, and one can learn them basically from early age. And those identities are formed by the families, school, institutions, friends, and just other surroundings. In this research, I will focus on national identity. Here you can see the list of aspects which are tied to the national identity. You can also see these aspects as basically answers on a question, what contributes to the fact that someone feels as a member of a nation? Well, first, it might be because of the national history. This national history consists, of course, from many historical events which might happen, but also from many myths and flawless heroes, which stories together support the national values. This all is then represented by the so-called places of memory. For example, National Mall in Washington, D.C. To see that these places of memory are representing this history which the nation was built on, we can see that it is also quite that the history lives up today. For example, in the case of Richmond and its Monument Avenue few years ago. Many people also associate their nation with its beautiful landscape. And of course, one can see this beautiful and innocent, pure nature by their eyes, but also you can hear it very often in many songs. Who wouldn't know Sweet Home Alabama, where the skies is always blue, or the West Virginia Blue Ridge Mountains, Shenandoah River in Country Roads. Such landscapes are even often depicted in many paintings and postcards or souvenirs and so on. Of course, each nation has their own traditions and costumes. Some nations can have their own religion or language. And all these aspects are then represented by the national symbols. For example, a flag, which basically represent all these aspects and many more. Here I covered the national identity, but most of these aspects can be also tied to the state identity in the United States as well. What is interesting on the United States is that it's one country consisted from many states, and therefore there can be people having dual identity, having national and state identity, or just one of them. But the very state identities were basically the central reason for creating American federalism. And United States basically has an evolution of this national/state identity. In early ages, before the revolution, during the colonial era, if we can even speak about identities, it would be state identities mostly, or basically just state identities. And then during the revolution and many years after it, the national American identity was formed. And now in present days, it seems like a majority of people would identify themselves primarily as Americans. This is also supported by a very nationalized political environment full of slogans as "Make America Great Again" and so on. The question of the state identity is then also very difficult due to the fact that many Americans move quite often because of the school or their work or just for their loved ones. And so they can have a history of living in many different states in their life. The state identity can be supported by education, especially early education as primary education and high school, or by the political attitudes, which might be affiliated to the particular state. And what is interesting is that it is proven that the high trust in state government usually mean that the person has a strong state identity. Here on this map, I would like just to demonstrate you that it's not only about the state identity, it can be also regional identity. Here on this map, you can see 11 different cultures in the US. And it's also, again, complex topic. So if you're interested, you can read the book or chapter from Christopher Woodard. But what is important to notice is that very often the boundaries, the borders of the states don't always mean the borders for the culture and therefore even identity. Now to the interviews. The research question for me here is, do you feel more like an American or as a particular state member? And what does being from this state mean to you? I have found 4 different interviewees. 3 of them are my friends. One of them was recommended by Dr. Bohon. I try to find people with a different age, from different states, and with different experiences where and how they lived in the United States. So now I would like to welcome you to the interview part, and let's see what these amazing people want to share with you.
My name is Nicole Timofeevsky, and I'm originally from California, now living in Washington, D.C.
Rob Atkinson from Eastern Virginia.
Christian Anthony. I'm from Chicago.
My name is Steve Melcheski, and I live in Falmouth, Maine, which is southern Maine.
I lived in Utah for 2 years, and I lived in Tennessee for 2 years.
I lived in Lexington, Kentucky when I went to university, and I lived in Czech Republic for about 5 months.
I've lived in New York City, well, New York State. I grew up in New York State, and I've lived in New York City as well, but I grew up in central New York. And then I lived in California for almost 10 years.
My home state is still California.
Virginia.
Illinois, for sure. Chicago. A lot of my family is here. A lot of friends here. So my church is here. So I definitely call Chicago home.
New York's my home state.
California is still home for me because I have lived there the longest. My family still resides there, or my parents still live there. And the majority of my close friends and connections live there or have homes and families there. I grew up living by the ocean and am very much connected to the lifestyle of living by the ocean and having that accessible. So whenever I find myself near a port city or by a beach and an ocean, it starts feeling like home. So that's what makes also California very much there's a lot of a style of living that's a little bit calmer and relaxed and laid back that's very familiar to me and feels like home. So that also contributes to it.
I think I'm knowledgeable about the geography and also the history. Much more I don't know than I do, but I certainly know more about Virginia history than the history of any other state.
I would say that the four seasons are important to me. I think that growing up where you have the sometimes brutal winters of Chicago and sometimes the blistering summers, even though the environment can be challenging, it it grows on you. It teaches you about yourself, and you learn to appreciate the qualities of nature that come with all four seasons. And I think, of course, with any culture, you have the food and how that food influences the people.
I think the identity isn't necessary. So I was born in New Jersey, actually. But I only lived there for a few years of my life that I don't remember. I think for me anyway, and I would think it probably applies to a lot of Americans, where you go to school and graduate high school from has a lot to do with your identity in the end of the day.
I don't know. I've never really thought about that question, to be honest.
The last time people had to make that decision, I think, was the Civil War.
I don't even know what I would consider like Illinoisian. Because northern Illinois is very different from the south. You have Chicagoland and then you have grasslands and farmlands and cornfields. And my town is sort of situated right on the edge of both.
I would say both pretty equally. I think it's unusual for someone to weigh the state as high as I do.
I mean, it's kind of hard. I've been influenced by so many different cultures. How could I say that, I'm not more Czech than Kentucky? It's once you've been touched by a culture that it influences you for life. And the more you stay in contact, especially with the people, even though you might not be in the country, you're still getting a taste every time you interact with those people. So to say that I'm one more than the other, it's hard to distinguish.
Well, I'm a little unusual in that my family has stayed in Virginia. I like to say they weren't clever enough to leave. They weren't clever enough to figure a way out, so we've always stayed. And but it only goes back so far. I think most of my ancestors arrived in the 17 or 1800s. So it's not ancient like Europe.
I honestly probably identify more as a Californian than as an American.
Mhm.
I think if I were to explain why, I've lived the most time in California, and from a political sense, like am more aligned with a lot of the progressiveness that California has than American ideals as a whole. So I don't feel very patriotic or very closely tied to like my American identity. But I have a pride and patriotism of being Californian, so I'm probably more comfortable identifying. So if I were to travel abroad and someone would ask me where I'm from, I would not say United States, I would say California.
So much of our culture is formed around our public school system, right? We play sports, we do acting, we do music, all of our worlds revolve around that. And I think that although I have a lot of Maine in me because I've spent much more time here than I have in New York, I still have an identity for the region of New York I grew up in. I think when I travel overseas, I'm an American, plain and simple. I'm an American. Within the country itself, I'm from the Northeast, So, which has a certain cultural identity. I'm not a Californian, although I lived there for 10 years. I'm not a Californian. I was always a transplanted East Coaster. So I'm an East Coaster. And then when you get right down to it within your own geographical region between Vermont, Northeast people, Vermont, Maine, Massachusetts, now I am from Maine. If someone asks me where I'm from here because I live here. And I identify more as a Maine person at this point in my life, I would say.
I hope that you enjoyed the interviews. Now, what could we learn from them? Well, first, we can see that most of the participants mentioned similar aspects as I mentioned in the presentation, which contributes to their identity as history, landscape, values, or even political views. Some of them even mentioned family and friends being important for their state identity. Steve also was talking about the fact that when he's traveling, he sees himself more as American, and when he's back home, his state identity is stronger. What I really value is that all four interviewees had very different reasons for their state or national identity and why they feel like that. There are also different combinations of these identities. There were two people who had stronger state identities, and two people who we could say had a dual identity as American and a state member. What was also interesting in this regard is that Steve mentioned regional identity, that he sees himself more as a person from Northeast, or even the city identity, since Chris was talking about being from Chicago and not primarily from Illinois. And now key takeaways from you. First, this all project only supports the fact that there's such a huge diversity in the United States. It's one country, but it has 50 states in it. And it means more culture and more different identities. And it's quite unique that here, for this reason, people can have both dual national and state identity, or just prioritize one of these identities. And I would recommend you, do not perceive everyone in the United States as Americans only. Ask your friends and people you meet, where are they from, what they like on their states, and if there's anything they're proud of in their state. And then you would be able to understand American culture even more. Here you can see some sources. And speaking about sources, I would like to say that I really enjoyed this topic, and I would be grateful to see more researcher, more academia focusing on this topic of state versus national identity in the United States. And thank you for your attention. Thank also my interviewees. And here are some final closing remarks from Steve and Chris.
I think there's a lot of diverse identities in the US. And our culture is quite different depending on where you are. California culture is a lot different than Maine culture. Maine culture is even different from Vermont culture, although we're neighbors. And all you have to do in the US is drive across the border and you can see the difference. Literally, when you drive from Maine to New Hampshire's an hour from us. And when you drive across the border, the real estate looks different, the houses look different, the feeling of the state is different, the people are different. So it's a very small, they're small and subtle changes, but your attitudes are really state driven, in my opinion. Very, very much state driven. And when you go and move from one state to another, it takes a while for the people of that state to accept you. And you have to come along with their mores and traditions and culture to some degree in order to get along in that state, in my opinion. So there you go.
Never miss an opportunity to learn about a different culture, or a different way to think, or a different way to live. And if there's a subject or an identity that just seems so foreign to you, or you can never understand, make an effort to learn, because you'll find something out about yourself that you didn't realize.